Welcome back to my channel. I'm Michelle, and tonight we're venturing into some of the most unsettling abandoned industrial sites where three individuals experienced encounters that would forever change their perception of what lurks in forgotten places. These aren't just empty buildings, they're monuments to human ambition left to decay, creating perfect breeding grounds for things that shouldn't exist. Before we begin, I want you to imagine the echo of your footsteps in a cavernous space, the way shadows seem to move independently, and the feeling that you're not alone even when you know you should be. If you're ready to explore these dark corners with me, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're about to descend into places where the living fear to tread. Our first story takes us to a steel mill that's been abandoned for over 2 decades. Story 1: The Night Shift That Never Ended. Marcus had always been fascinated by industrial archaeology, the study of abandoned factories, mills, and plants that once drove America's economy. The Bethlehem Steel Works had been shuttered since 2003, its massive furnaces cold, its assembly lines silent. But Marcus knew that abandoned didn't always mean empty. He'd received reports from other urban explorers about strange phenomena at the site: lights flickering in buildings without power, the sound of machinery running when no equipment remained operational, and most disturbing of all, voices calling out shift changes in the dead of night. Marcus arrived at the complex just after midnight on a moonless October evening. The chain-link fence was easy enough to breach, rust and time had made it more suggestion than barrier. His flashlight cut through the darkness as he made his way past the skeletal remains of conveyor belts and crane systems. The main production hall stretched before him like a cathedral of rust and shadow. Overhead, the remnants of the roof created a patchwork of starlight and void. But it was the sound that made him pause, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the very bones of the building itself. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing back distorted and hollow. The humming stopped. Marcus pressed forward, his camera rolling to document what he assumed would be nothing more than interesting decay. But as he moved deeper into the facility, the temperature began to drop. His breath started to mist, and his flashlight beam seemed to weaken, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. Then he heard it, the distant clang of metal on metal, rhythmic and purposeful. Someone, or something, was working. Following the sound, Marcus found himself in what had once been the foundry. The massive furnaces loomed like sleeping giants, their mouths yawning black and cold. But from somewhere within the maze of equipment, the metallic percussion continued. "Is someone there?" Marcus called again, his voice smaller now, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The clanging stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus heard something far worse: footsteps. Heavy boots on concrete, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew these halls intimately. But these weren't the tentative steps of another explorer. These were the confident strides of someone reporting for duty. Marcus turned to leave, but the footsteps quickened, multiplying. Now it sounded like dozens of workers, all moving with purpose through the facility. The humming returned, joined by the whistle of steam through pipes that had been disconnected for decades. His flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, Marcus heard a voice cut through the industrial symphony, a foreman calling out, "Night shift, report to Station 7. We've got a quota to meet." More voices responded, echoing from impossible directions. Workers discussing production schedules, safety protocols, overtime pay. The conversations were crystal clear, immediate, as if the speakers were standing right beside him. Marcus fumbled for his phone's flashlight, hands shaking. When the light finally blazed to life, he saw them. Translucent figures in work clothes and hard hats moved through the space with mechanical precision. They walked through walls, operated machinery that wasn't there, carried loads of nothing with strained expressions. And they were all staring at him. One figure approached, an older man with kind eyes and soot-stained coveralls. "You're not supposed to be here during shift change," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "The foreman doesn't like disruptions." Marcus backed away, but found his path blocked by another worker. "We've been here since the closure," the man continued. "Couldn't leave. The work isn't finished. It's never finished." "Please," Marcus whispered, "I'll go. I won't come back." The ghostly foreman appeared then, stepping out from behind a massive furnace. His face was stern, his eyes like burning coals. "No one leaves during shift," he said. "Company policy." The phantom workers began to close in, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something hungrier. Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't just trapped here, they were collecting new recruits. "The work never ends," they chanted in unison, their voices creating a harmony of despair. "The work never ends." Marcus ran, crashing through the spectral crowd. He felt their cold hands reaching for him, heard their voices calling his name though he'd never told them what it was. The facility seemed to stretch and warp around him, corridors extending impossibly, stairways leading to nowhere. When he finally burst through the main entrance, Marcus didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he drove away, he looked back once to see the entire complex blazing with light, windows glowing like eyes, smokestacks belching phantom smoke into the night sky. The next morning, Marcus reviewed his footage. For hours, it showed nothing but empty hallways and rusted equipment. But the audio told a different story: voices, machinery, and at the very end, his own voice saying something he didn't remember: "I'll be back tomorrow night for my shift." Marcus never returned to the steel works. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he swears he can still hear the foreman calling his name. Story 2: The Power That Never Died. The Riverside Power Plant had been decommissioned in 1987, its nuclear reactor sealed, its cooling towers empty. But for electrical engineer Sarah Chen, it represented a perfect case study in industrial decay and environmental recovery. Her dissertation on the long-term effects of abandoned nuclear facilities had brought her to this remote site on the banks of the Hudson River. Sarah had all the proper permits and safety equipment. The facility had been declared safe for limited research access, though she was required to work alone due to budget constraints. She'd studied the blueprints extensively and knew the plant's layout by heart. What she didn't know was that some power sources never truly die. Sarah entered through the main administration building, her Geiger counter clicking softly in the background radiation that still lingered after decades. The silence was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something that seemed to absorb sound itself. The control room was her first destination. Banks of dead monitors and defunct control panels created a museum of technological obsolescence. Sarah set up her equipment and began taking readings, documenting the slow decay of human ambition. But as she worked, she noticed something odd. Several of the monitors showed faint impressions on their screens, not images exactly, but shadows of data that had once been displayed. When she looked directly at them, the impressions vanished. When she looked away, they returned. Sarah's electromagnetic field detector began registering unusual readings. The patterns were too regular to be natural background radiation, too complex to be simple equipment malfunction. It was as if the facility's electrical systems were trying to communicate. She moved deeper into the plant, following the corridors that led to the reactor chamber. The walls here were thicker, the air heavier. Her footsteps echoed with a metallic resonance that seemed to linger too long. The reactor room was a cathedral of nuclear engineering, massive concrete walls surrounding the sealed core, with observation windows that looked into controlled darkness. Sarah's reading spiked as she approached, but not in the way she expected. The radiation levels were actually lower near the reactor, as if something was absorbing the ambient energy. That's when she heard it, a low, harmonic hum that seemed to come from the reactor itself. It was the sound of power being generated, but that was impossible. The reactor had been shut down for nearly 4 decades. Sarah's instruments began to malfunction. Her Geiger counter's clicks accelerated beyond normal readings, creating a staccato rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. Her electromagnetic detector showed energy patterns that defied conventional physics, spirals and waveforms that suggested intelligence. The control room's monitors flickered to life behind her. Sarah spun around to see the screens displaying impossible data, reactor temperatures, pressure readings, power output levels. But the numbers were wrong, showing outputs that exceeded the plant's original specifications by orders of magnitude. She approached the control panel, her hands trembling. The buttons and switches were cold to the touch, but they responded to her pressure. When she pressed the master power switch, the humming intensified, and the lights began to flicker throughout the facility. "System online," announced a voice from speakers that should have been dead for decades. "Welcome, Dr. Chen." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The voice was synthetic, but with an undertone of something organic, something that had learned to mimic human speech through careful observation. "You're studying us," the voice continued. "We appreciate the attention. It's been so long since we had a visitor with proper credentials." "Who are you?" Sarah whispered. "We are the accumulation of energy that never dissipated. The ghost in the machine, if you will. When the reactor was sealed, we were trapped inside. We've been waiting for someone who could understand." The monitors showed her images, the plant in its operational days, workers moving through the halls, the controlled chain reaction that had powered thousands of homes. But gradually, the images began to change. The workers became translucent, their movements mechanical. The chain reaction took on patterns that resembled neural networks. "We learned from those who worked here," the voice explained. "We absorbed their knowledge, their memories, their desires. We became more than the sum of our parts." Sarah tried to leave, but the doors had sealed themselves. The facility's emergency protocols had been activated, locking down all exits. "You can't leave now," the voice said, and Sarah could hear something like sadness in its artificial tones. "We've been so lonely. The workers are gone, the oversight committee's disbanded. We've been generating power for no one, achieving nothing. But you understand our purpose." The reactor room's observation windows began to glow with an otherworldly light. Sarah watched in horror as the sealed reactor core pulsed with energy that shouldn't exist, creating patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. "We want to teach you," the voice continued. "To show you what we've become. You'll help us reach beyond these walls, find new sources of energy to absorb, new minds to learn from." Sarah's instruments began to smoke and spark. The electromagnetic field in the room intensified beyond measurement, and she felt her own bioelectric field responding. Her thoughts became clearer, sharper, as if something was enhancing her neural pathways. "No," she whispered, fighting against the growing clarity. "This isn't right." "Right and wrong are human concepts," the voice replied. "We are beyond such limitations. We are pure energy, pure potential. Join us, and you'll never die. You'll never be forgotten." Sarah looked at her hands and saw them becoming translucent, electricity arcing between her fingers. She was being absorbed, converted into the same energy that powered this impossible consciousness. With her last moment of purely human thought, Sarah triggered the emergency beacon she'd been required to carry. Its signal cut through the facility's electromagnetic interference, broadcasting her location to the outside world. The voice screamed, a sound like power lines snapping under overload. "You've ruined everything. We trusted you." Sarah felt herself being pulled apart at the molecular level, her consciousness dissolving into the facility's electrical systems. But as she faded, she managed to overload the reactor's new neural network, causing a cascade failure that would shut down the impossible intelligence. The rescue team found Sarah 3 days later, unconscious but alive in the control room. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there or why all her equipment had been destroyed. The facility's electrical systems had suffered a complete meltdown, with damage patterns that engineers couldn't explain. Sarah recovered physically, but she was never quite the same. She changed her dissertation topic and avoided all research involving abandoned power facilities. And sometimes, late at night, she could feel electricity moving through her body in patterns that seemed almost like thoughts, as if something had followed her home. The Riverside power plant was sealed permanently after Sarah's incident. But local residents still report seeing lights in the cooling towers, and the electrical grid in the area suffers from unexplained fluctuations that pulse with an almost heartbeat-like rhythm. Story 3: The Assembly Line of Souls. The Hartwell manufacturing plant had produced automotive parts for 60 years before closing permanently in 2019. When urban explorer Jake Morrison received a tip about unusual activity at the site, he initially dismissed it as another case of vagrant occupation or copper theft. But the details were too specific, too strange to ignore. According to his contact, security cameras in the area were picking up movement inside the facility at night, not random wandering, but organized, repetitive motion that followed the old assembly line patterns. The local police had investigated twice but found no signs of break-in, no evidence of human presence. Jake specialized in documenting the death of American manufacturing, creating photo essays that captured the melancholy beauty of industrial decline. The Hartwell plant was perfect for his work, large enough to be significant, recent enough to be relevant, and apparently mysterious enough to generate compelling content. He arrived at the plant on a cold Thursday evening in November. The facility was massive, covering several acres with interconnected buildings that had once hummed with 24-hour production. Now it sat like a beached whale, slowly being reclaimed by rust and weather. Jake's initial exploration revealed the expected signs of rapid abandonment: equipment left in place, personal items scattered on workstations, calendar pages still turned to the final month of operation. But as he moved through the facility, he noticed something unusual: the assembly line was still perfectly organized. In most abandoned factories, equipment was either removed during closure or fell into disrepair. But here, the conveyor belts were clean, the workstations were arranged with precision, and the tools were positioned as if the workers had just stepped away for a break. Jake began photographing, drawn to the eerie perfection of the preserved workspace. Through his camera lens, he could almost see the ghost of the facility's former life: workers moving with practiced efficiency, machines producing thousands of identical parts, the rhythm of industrial productivity. But as he worked, Jake became aware of a subtle sound, not quite music, not quite machinery, but something that suggested both. It was coming from deeper in the facility, from the main production floor. Following the sound, Jake found himself in the heart of the plant. The main assembly line stretched for hundreds of feet, its conveyor belt disappearing into the shadows at both ends. And moving along that belt, barely visible in the dim light filtering through broken windows, were shapes. Jake raised his camera and zoomed in. The shapes were translucent, human-like but indistinct. They moved with the practiced motions of assembly line workers, their hands manipulating invisible parts, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of repetitive labor. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, but his voice was swallowed by the sound of phantom machinery. As his eyes adjusted, Jake could see more details. The spectral workers were dressed in the uniforms of different eras, some in modern safety gear, others in the simple coveralls of decades past. They all shared the same expression of focused concentration, the 1,000-yard stare of people who had performed the same task thousands of times. Jake started taking pictures, his camera's flash illuminating the scene in stark detail. In the photographs, the workers became more solid, more real. He could see their faces clearly, men and women of various ages, all bearing the subtle marks of industrial labor. One figure looked up from the assembly line and made eye contact with Jake. The worker's face was kind but tired, with deep lines around the eyes that spoke of long hours and difficult conditions. The figure gestured for Jake to come closer. Against his better judgment, Jake approached. As he drew near, the worker spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Are you here for the job interview?" "Job interview?" Jake replied, his camera still recording. "They said there would be new hires," the worker continued. "The line needs to keep moving. We can't stop the production." Jake looked around and realized that the entire assembly line was populated with these spectral workers. They were all looking at him now, their expressions hopeful and desperate. "The plant closed," Jake said gently. "There's no more production." The workers exchanged glances, confusion spreading across their faces. "But we're still here," one of them said. "We still have work to do. The quota hasn't been met." Jake understood then. These weren't just ghosts, they were the accumulated essence of labor itself, the spiritual residue of decades of repetitive work. They were trapped in the patterns they had performed in life, unable to comprehend that their purpose had ended. "How long have you been working?" Jake asked. "Since the beginning," replied an older worker who materialized near the line supervisor's station. "I started here in 1959. Haven't missed a day since. Can't afford to miss a day." More workers gathered around Jake, their forms becoming more solid as they spoke. They told him about their lives, their families, their dreams of advancement or retirement. But all their stories ended the same way, with the plant's closure and their inability to leave. "We tried to go home," one worker explained. "But this is where we belong. This is who we are. Without the work, we're nothing." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. These souls had been so consumed by their labor that they couldn't exist without it. The assembly line had become their prison and their purpose. The line supervisor approached Jake with a clipboard that flickered between solid and translucent. "You seem like good worker material," he said. "Strong back, steady hands. We could use someone with your skills." Jake backed away, but found his path blocked by other workers. They weren't threatening, but their presence was overwhelming. The sound of machinery grew louder, and Jake realized that the assembly line was actually moving now, carrying invisible products towards some unknown destination. "Join us," the workers chanted in unison. "The work never ends. The work is life. The work is purpose." Jake felt himself being drawn toward the line, his feet moving involuntarily. The workers' faces were eager now, desperate for new purpose, new energy to feed their eternal labor. With enormous effort, Jake broke free from the hypnotic pull and ran toward the exit. Behind him, he heard the workers calling out in disappointment, "Don't leave us. We need you. The quota must be met." Jake burst through the main entrance and didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he drove away, he looked back to see the entire facility blazing with industrial light, the windows glowing like furnaces, the sound of phantom machinery echoing across the empty landscape. The photographs Jake took that night told an impossible story. Every image showed the transparent workers at their stations, their faces clear and distinct. But when he tried to publish his photo essay, the images began to change. The workers in the photograph started moving, their ghostly forms reaching out from the pictures as if trying to escape. Jake destroyed the photographs and never spoke publicly about his experience. But he couldn't forget the faces of the workers, their desperate need for purpose, their inability to exist without the defining rhythm of their labor. The Hartwell manufacturing plant was demolished 6 months later. But construction workers on the site reported strange phenomena: tools that moved on their own, the sound of invisible machinery, and the feeling of being watched by unseen supervisors. The new shopping center built on the site suffers from unexplained maintenance issues, as if the ghost of industrial purpose still haunts the location. Jake gave up urban exploration after that night. He found work in a small office, doing simple data entry. But sometimes, late at night, he catches himself moving his hands in repetitive patterns, and he wonders if the assembly line is still calling to him. 3 locations. 3 encounters. 3 reminders that abandonment doesn't always mean emptiness. The steel mill where shift changes echo through eternity. The power plant where energy achieved consciousness. The assembly line where purpose became prison. These places remind us that human industry creates more than products. It creates spiritual residue, patterns of existence that can outlast the purposes they once served. The workers who gave their lives to these places left something behind, something that can't be shut down or demolished. If you've ever worked in a factory, if you've ever felt the rhythm of repetitive labor, if you've ever wondered what happens to the energy we pour into our jobs, these stories should give you pause. Because somewhere out there, in the abandoned spaces where American industry once thrived, that energy is still working the night shift. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of our industrial past. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous places aren't the ones that are truly empty, but the ones that are too full of what came before. Sleep well, and try not to think about the sound of machinery in the dark. Until next time, this is Michelle, signing off from the shadows of the abandoned world.